June 4, 1916. 6 in the morning. Along a front line stretching for 180 miles, something extraordinary was about to happen. While Europe watched the hell of Verdun, where 700,000 men would die in a single location, something even larger was unfolding thousands of miles away, in the east. More than 1.5 million Russian soldiers were about to launch the largest offensive attack in military history. It would not be over one day. It would not be over 1 week. It would last 108 days of continuous combat. 2 million lives lost. Entire cities conquered and abandoned. An empire destroyed. And most people have never even heard of it. In this 25-minute documentary, you're going to discover the complete story of the Brusilov Offensive, the military operation that changed the course of World War I and led the Russian Empire directly into collapse. Over the next 25 minutes, you're going to learn how a Russian general completely revolutionized offensive military tactics. You're going to meet the men who commanded this operation, from General Brusilov, the Iron General, to the Austro-Hungarian commanders who watched their empire crumble day after day. You're going to hear stories of individual soldiers. Some who became heroes. Others who simply tried to survive one more day. You're going to see how an offensive plan for 2 weeks turned into 3 months of combat that destroyed the Austro-Hungarian army. And you're going to understand why, despite all this military victory, it would take less than a year for Russia itself to collapse into revolution. If you love in-depth military history and want to understand how strategic decisions changed the course of history, this is the documentary for you. To understand why the Brusilov offensive happened, we need to go back several months. It's December 1915. The military leaders of the Allied countries, Britain, France, Russia, Italy, Belgium, and Serbia, are in crisis. The war that was supposed to be quick and decisive has already lasted more than a year. Millions have died. The trenches are locked. Nobody can advance more than a few miles. On the Western Front, the attrition is total. French and British forces are facing the German war machine in a fight they cannot win. French General Joseph Joffre calls an inter-allied conference. The objectives are clear: coordinate simultaneous offensives on multiple fronts to divide enemy forces. It's not a new idea. But it's the only chance they see. The strategic thinking is simple: if we attack in 3 places at once, West, East, and Italy, the Germans won't have enough troops to defend everything. They'll have to retreat somewhere. Then comes February 1916. German General Erich von Falkenhayn launches Operation Judgment against the city of Verdun. The objective is explicit: not to conquer the city, but to bleed France white. To kill so many Frenchmen that France will quit the war. Every day, tens of thousands of soldiers fall. The French lose about 2,000 men per day defending every square mile of ground. Meanwhile, the Germans lose even more. But the plan continues. France is desperate. General Joffre phones General Aleksei Brusilov, commander of the Russian Southwest Front. The message is clear: General, we need a large-scale offensive in the east. Immediately. It must begin in June. Brusilov receives the order and does something extraordinary. He doesn't just agree to the offensive. He redesigns it completely. Most Russian generals want to concentrate all forces on a single attack, try to break the line at one point. It's the traditional tactic. It has always failed on the Western Front. But Brusilov sees something nobody else notices. The Austro-Hungarian army is spread dangerously thin across a 180-mile front. Not in strategic depth. Just stretched out. Like a thin wire stretched too far. Brusilov has an audacious idea: attack not at one point, but at multiple points along the entire front. Force the enemy to decide where to concentrate defenses. But since there are attacks happening everywhere, they can't. The line disintegrates in several places. It was revolutionary. But first, he needed a man to lead it. General Aleksei Alexievich Brusilov was born in Tiflis, Georgia, in 1853. At age 63, he already had a legendary military career. He had fought in the Russo-Turkish War. He had trained Russian military elite. And he had distinguished himself in the early years of World War I with innovative tactics. His soldiers called him the Iron General. It wasn't a term of endearment. It was respect mixed with fear. Brusilov was known for his rigid discipline. A soldier 2 minutes late to formation would be publicly punished. But his soldiers also respected him because he was brilliant. He refused to waste lives on pointless attacks. Every movement was calculated. Every assault was prepared with air reconnaissance, intelligence, planning. Before you attack, know your enemy, he would say. Ignorance costs lives. When he received the order to plan the offensive, Brusilov did something that surprised his superiors. He asked for more time. He asked for more resources. He asked for extensive air reconnaissance. And then, in April 1916, he presented his plan: not a single attack, but multiple coordinated attacks along the entire front. On the other side of the line was Franz Conrad von Hötzendorf, chief of the Austro-Hungarian General Staff. Conrad was the opposite of Brusilov in almost every way. While Brusilov planned meticulously each move, Conrad often acted on impulse. While Brusilov respected his soldiers, Conrad saw them as numbers on a board. Conrad had spread his forces across 180 miles of front. Too thin. Too spread out. Without flexibility. When Austro-Hungarian intelligence began reporting that the Russians were concentrating for a massive assault, Conrad didn't believe it. Impossible, he said. The Russian army is too weakened. They can't. They're not capable. But they were capable. And Brusilov had planned every detail. Working with Brusilov were generals Alexei Kaldin, Pavel Lechitsky, and Dmitry Sherbachev. All had reputations for competence. All were selected by Brusilov specifically because they could execute complex tactical maneuvers. On the Austro-Hungarian side, Conrad had left generals of questionable quality in critical positions. Some of them would be placed in impossible situations over the next 108 days. And they would fail. Dramatically. Brusilov's strategy was so radical that many Russian generals thought it was madness. Let me explain why it worked. The traditional tactic in World War I was simple: choose one point, concentrate all your firepower on that point, and try to break through. The British tried this at the Somme. Failed. The French tried this at Verdun. Failed. The reason is always the same: the enemy sees the attack coming and concentrates their defenses at that same point. Two frontal assaults against prepared defenses never work. Brusilov saw this clearly. So he didn't make one frontal assault. He made multiple simultaneous assaults. Not just 2 points. Not just 3. 5 different attack points along the Austro-Hungarian line. Lutsk. Kaul. Brody. Stanislav. Chernowitz. Cities hundreds of miles apart from each other. All attacked on the same day. At the same time. What did this do? It forced Conrad to decide, where are the main attacks? He couldn't reinforce all 5 locations at once. While he reinforced one point, another broke through the line. While he reinforced another point, the first point advanced. The Austrian line simply disintegrated. But there was another element. Brusilov insisted on something that seemed old-fashioned: training. His soldiers were specifically trained for assaulting trenches. How to move between trenches. How to deal with enemy artillery. How to maintain leadership under fire. Most armies in the war didn't provide this kind of training. Brusilov did. And it worked. His soldiers knew what to do when combat came. They weren't confused recruits. They were professional soldiers in a well-oiled machine. Finally, there was the question of artillery. Brusilov required that each artillery battery be positioned to cover multiple areas. If the infantry advanced, the artillery advanced right behind them, creating a curtain of fire that protected the advance. These were tactics so effective that the Germans would see and copy them a year later. It was 1918. The Germans would launch the Spring Offensive using basically the same tactics that Brusilov developed in 1916. But that's another story. At the moment, in May 1916, Brusilov was finishing his preparations. 1.5 million Russian soldiers were positioned. Resources had been accumulated. Plans had been transmitted to every division commander. Air reconnaissance confirmed that the Austro-Hungarians still expected nothing this large. On June 3, Brusilov gave his final order to his commanders: tomorrow, we change history. June 4, 1916. 6:15 in the morning. 2,000 Russian guns opened fire simultaneously. This isn't a small preparatory bombardment. This is the apocalypse. For 7 straight days, Russian artillery fires continuously. 250,000 shells rain down on Austro-Hungarian positions. Trenches aren't just destroyed. The ground itself changes shape. Craters open. Entire trenches vanish. Bunkers are buried under tons of earth. The Austro-Hungarians on the front line simply cease to exist. Many don't even have time to die. They just disappear. Russian soldiers watch from their trenches as the distant earth becomes a hell of flames and smoke. Some pray. Some pretend they're not afraid. Some know they'll be dead in hours and accept it. A Russian soldier, Ivan Gregorovic, writes in his diary that night, "The artillery never stops. You can hear the rumble even inside the bunker 3 meters deep. The Austrians must be dying by the thousands. Tomorrow we have to run over all that. God help us." Ivan would die 2 days later, hit by a machine gun bullet while climbing out of a captured trench. June 11. 1 week after the bombardment began. The results already surprise even Brusilov. At Lutsk, the Russians have advanced 40 miles. The Austro-Hungarian army simply cannot establish a coherent defensive line. Every time they concentrate troops at one point, the Russians attack somewhere else. In the city of Lutsk, General Aleksei Kaldin led the 8th Russian Army in a direct assault. The Austrians surrendered by the thousands. Not because they were cowards, but because their leadership was gone. Officers were dead. Communication lines were cut. Nobody knew where to go or what to do. It was pure chaos. Then came Kaldin with his well-organized soldiers, well-led, knowing exactly what to do. The Austrians had no chance. In one day, the 8th Russian Army captured 80,000 prisoners. 80,000 men. None of them wanted to die. All of them wanted to go home. The Russians didn't even have enough guards for all of them. They had to let them march to the rear practically without escort. Many never reached prisoner of war camps. Either they were recaptured by Austro-Hungarians who were in panic trying to establish a new front line, or they simply walked in the wrong direction and disappeared. By the end of the first week, the Russians had advanced between 25 and 60 miles in 5 separate sectors. This hadn't happened on the Eastern Front since 1914. Conrad received report after report of disaster. He still didn't fully believe what was happening. But his generals were telling him the truth he reluctant to accept. Sir, the Northern Front has disintegrated. June passes. July arrives. The situation for Austria-Hungary only gets worse. It's not just a military defeat. It's a collapse of institutional morale. The Austro-Hungarian army wasn't just German. It was a patchwork of nationalities. There were Germans, of course, but also Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, Ukrainians, Croats, Serbs, Romanians, Slovenes, and Italians. Some belonged to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Others were reluctant subjects. The Czechs, for example, didn't really want to fight for Austria. When the Russians attacked, many Czech units offered no real resistance. They simply surrendered. Or in the worst cases, switched sides. There were documented cases of entire Czech units refusing to fire and surrendering without a fight. Not because they were cowards, but because they saw no reason to die for Austria-Hungary. They saw in Russia a power that could liberate their countries. Week after week, the Russians conquered more territory. First Lutsk fell. Then Brody. Then Stanislav. Finally Czernowitz. Cities that had been Austro-Hungarian for centuries were lost in days. The Austro-Hungarian government in Vienna entered full panic. Emperor Franz Joseph, now 85 years old and in fragile health, convened his council. The options were, continue losing territory in the army, or make peace. Both options were politically unacceptable. Franz Joseph had sworn never to make peace with Russia. But if they didn't make peace, they would be destroyed. Conrad insisted he could contain the situation if he received reinforcements. German reinforcements. So the Germans sent elite divisions from the Western Front. This was a colossal Allied error to realize. Because to reinforce Austria-Hungary, the Germans had to withdraw troops from Verdun, where they were facing the French in equally bloody combat. Brusilov had achieved his primary strategic objective, relieving pressure on Verdun. His offensive was working exactly as planned. But the Russian general had no intention of stopping there. He wanted to completely destroy the Austro-Hungarian army. There were still at least 2 months of campaign ahead. August 1916. Brusilov is at his peak. The offensive has already killed hundreds of thousands of Austro-Hungarian soldiers. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners have been captured. But now there's a problem that even Brusilov didn't completely anticipate. His own army is exhausted. You cannot invade 300 miles of territory without your soldiers suffering massive loss. The supply lines are stretched to the maximum. Ammunition is running short in some units. Food is heavily rationed. The soldiers who began the campaign in June are now thin, covered in lice, suffering from dysentery and infections. Typhus is spreading through the troops like wildfire. A Russian soldier writes at this time, "We have killed so many Austrians. We have marched so far. But with every victory, we are dying too. Half of my platoon has dysentery. A quarter are wounded. Only a few of us can still shoot straight. How is it possible that the enemy surrenders when we are as weakened as they are?" This soldier would never go home. He would die of infection from a bullet wound in September. But he put his finger on the central problem. The Russian army was winning. But winning in a terrible way. Brusilov knew this. He asked for reinforcements. He asked for ammunition. He asked for supplies. His request reached Tsar Nicholas II in Petrograd. And here begins a truly tragic part of the story. The Tsar agreed to send reinforcements. But he also did something that proves his complete disconnect from the reality of the battlefield. He decided to leave his war cabinet and take personal command of the armed forces. It was disastrous. The Tsar was not a general. He had no real military training. He had spent his entire life as an absolute monarch, not as a soldier. Now, in the middle of one of the greatest military campaigns in history, he was in command. Brusilov continued controlling his operations locally. But the overall command structure became confused. Who was in command? The Tsar? Brusilov? Both? Nobody knew clearly. This led to delays in critical decisions. At a crucial point in August, Brusilov saw an opportunity to encircle the entire enemy army in a decisive battle. He asked authorization to launch a final encirclement offensive. His request went to the Tsar. The Tsar consulted his advisors. His advisors debated. 3 days of delay. When authorization finally arrived, the opportunity had passed. The enemy had reorganized. It was a lost moment that could have ended the campaign in August. Instead, the fighting would continue until September. With more deaths, more suffering, more attrition. Not just of Austro-Hungarian soldiers, but of Russians too. How do you end an offensive that has killed 2 million people? Brusilov didn't have a clear answer. By mid-September, the right moment to stop had passed. The troops were exhausted. The territorial gains had diminished. Austro-Hungarian counteroffensives, now supported by German reinforcements, were gaining ground again. On September 20, Brusilov received the order to end the offensive campaign. Officially, it was a gigantic success. The Russians conquered 180 miles of territory. They captured 400,000 prisoners. They killed or wounded approximately 1 million Austro-Hungarian soldiers. The Austro-Hungarian army would never fully recover. For the first time in the war, anyone could see that Austria-Hungary was on the brink of collapse. So why did Brusilov end it? Because his own army was at its limit. Of the troops that began in June, half were dead, wounded, or sick. The rest had no morale to continue. Even Russian soldiers, usually disciplined, were beginning to refuse attacks. Not openly. But it was happening. Units marched very slowly. Attacks were half-hearted. People were simply too tired to keep dying. Brusilov saw this and understood, continuing meant losing his entire army to attrition. Even in victory. So what was the military legacy of the Brusilov offensive? In one word, revolutionary. It proved that coordinated multiple attacks worked. It proved that intensive training and meticulous planning beat disorganized defense. It proved that you could break a trench stalemate if you were smart about it. A year later, the Germans realized this and copied many of Brusilov's tactics for their own 1918 offensive. It worked for them too. At least initially. But the most important lesson that military history would learn was terrible. Even in complete success, the cost was unbearable. 2 million lives lost to conquer territory that would be lost in weeks during the Russian Revolution. Brusilov's own military success would directly contribute to the fall of the Tsarist regime. Russian soldiers, having proven they could beat the enemy, now questioned why they needed to be there at all. Why die for Russia? Why die for a Tsar they didn't understand and who frequently betrayed them? The Russian Revolution would begin exactly 1 year later. In November 1917, the Russian army would collapse. Most historians credit the Brusilov offensive as one of the main factors leading to the collapse. Not because it was a military failure, but because it was a military success that nobody could explain to the soldiers why it needed to continue. Now let's talk about some curiosities and little-known facts about the Brusilov offensive. First, did you know this was the largest military offensive in history until that moment? More soldiers participated in the Brusilov offensive than in any previous military operation. Even the invasion of Normandy in 1944 had fewer soldiers involved on the first day than Brusilov had in total. Second curiosity, General Brusilov left extremely detailed records of his planning. His memoirs are studied in military academies today. Most of the tactics he developed for attacking trenches were adopted by armies all over the world. When the American army trained soldiers in trench assault, they frequently used modifications of Brusilov's tactics. Third, of the 2 million casualties in the Brusilov offensive, most didn't die in direct combat. They died from infection, dysentery, typhus, or gangrene. This was before antibiotics. A soldier with a bullet wound had about a 30% chance of dying from infection, even if the wound was properly treated. If the wound wasn't treated, and many weren't due to lack of doctors, mortality was much higher. There was 1 doctor for every 1,000 soldiers in the Russian army. Compare that to 1 doctor for every 100 soldiers in the British army. Fourth curiosity, there are records of cannibalism among some Russian units at the end of the campaign. Not on a large scale, but in isolated units that were cut off from supply for weeks. It's something that Russian historians generally don't mention, but captured Austro-Hungarian documents mention eyewitnesses to Russian soldiers eating corpses of dead soldiers. It's the brutal reality of extended warfare. Fifth, General Brusilov survived the war, the Russian Revolution, Stalin's purges, and lived until 1926, dying in the Soviet Union as a retired general. He was one of the few Tsarist generals who wasn't executed by Stalin. Probably because his tactics were so effective that even communists admired his military genius. Sixth, memorials for Brusilov offensive soldiers are still being discovered today. In 2019, construction workers in Ternopil, Ukraine, which was part of the captured territory, found a mass grave with remains of 1,500 Russian soldiers. Probably soldiers who died from wounds or diseases at the end of the campaign. It had a plaque written in Old Cyrillic that read, "Here lie our comrades. Let their memory be honored." Seventh curiosity, the Brusilov offensive completely changed how the world viewed Russia. Before, Russia was seen as a slow, incompetent giant. Afterward, it was seen as a military power that could beat anyone. This influenced political decisions in many countries. Romania, for example, entered the war on the Allied side mainly because it was impressed by Brusilov's victories. Italy also reinforced its troops on the Eastern Front because it believed that Brusilov would succeed. Eighth, Brusilov learned about his own limitations through this campaign. He knew you cannot fight forever. That even with perfect planning, human forces have limits. After the war, he would write in his memoirs, "The greatest lesson I learned from the 1916 offensive was that no amount of brilliant planning can substitute for human rest. Soldiers are not machines. They break. And when they break, no amount of military genius in the world can fix it." These words he learned while watching his soldiers die from exhaustion and disease in the final days of his offensive. So let's recap what we've seen. The Brusilov Offensive was the largest military offensive in history up until that time. It began on June 4, 1916, and ended on September 20, 1916. It involved 1.5 million Russian soldiers against the Austro-Hungarians. It resulted in 2 million casualties between both sides. The Austro-Hungarian army would never recover. Brusilov's own success would lead directly to the fall of the Tsarist regime less than a year later. Brusilov revolutionized military tactics, creating a model of coordinated attack that is still taught in military academies. But the story also shows us the absolute futility of World War I. 2 million people died. Cities were conquered. Empires were shaken. And in 1917, it all collapsed anyway. Russia would become communist. Austria-Hungary would completely disintegrate. The territory conquered by Brusilov would be lost, regained, lost again. And today, more than a century later, it continues to be disputed. History shows us that the Brusilov offensive was a brilliant tactical success. But a far greater strategic failure. Because winning the battle doesn't mean winning the war. And sometimes, winning one battle so expensively means you lose everything else. The story of the Brusilov offensive leaves us with an important reflection. General Aleksei Brusilov was a military genius. His tactics changed history. His plans were copied by armies around the world. And yet, his greatest success led to the collapse of everything he had defended. World War I was a war of contradictions. People who were successful militarily were often strategic failures. Those who survived often felt it wasn't worth it. Those who died left families who would never know why. When you observe the Brusilov offensive, you observe war in its purest form. Military brilliance. Human sacrifice. Complete success. Complete defeat. All at the same time. Every soldier who died in the Brusilov offensive deserved a better story. They deserved to die for something that made real difference. But instead, they died so Russia could become communist a year later. Now, you know that story. The complete story of the Brusilov offensive. The attack that changed the world. And the world didn't even notice. If you enjoyed this in-depth documentary, please leave a like. Share it with someone who also loves military history. If you want to follow our complete series on World War I battles, subscribe to the channel. In the next video, we're going to explore the Battle of the Somme, where the British Army lost 60,000 men in a single day.